to our 3-day conference devoted to the issue Freedom of Speech and Intellectual Diversity on Campus, sponsored by the LeFrak Forum at MSU. My name is Arthur Melzer. Now, at this morning's panel, we saw that there is considerable empirical evidence that there has been a decline in intellectual diversity in American universities. So the next question would be, well, so what? To address that question, we turn now to our next panel, whose precise instructions was to discuss this. In what precise ways and to what degree is this ideological imbalance a problem? A paper addressing this will be given by Joshua Dunn, professor and chair in the Department of Science at the University of Colorado, and our discussant, Amna Khalid, associate professor of history at Carleton College. Professor Dunn.
Thank you, Arthur. First, I want to say that I'm delighted and honored to be part of such a distinguished group. And I think this is obviously an important topic. So thank you for inviting me. I do want to actually kind of start where we left off with some of the questions at the end of the last session, which will take me back to the book that I co-wrote with my friend John Shields, which is why I'm here. So I wrote this book with John called Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. Jonathan mentioned that in some ways conservatives seem happier in the academy than some of the public presentations of the university might lead you to believe. And I think there is truth to that. That's some of what we found in our book, but there is some survivor bias, I think, was alluded to, that people who make it in and then run through the gauntlet and make it through tenure do tend to like the job and like their life. And of course, if they manage to make it through tenure, they probably have at least halfway decent relationships with their colleagues. But some of the things that we found just in doing this study illustrate, I think, some of the problems that I will discuss with the lack of viewpoint diversity in higher education. So the first thing I just want to mention, we interviewed 153 faculty in 6 different disciplines from the social sciences and humanities. And the second person that we interviewed asked us, well, what are you up to? And we said, well, we want to interview 150 so faculty and who self-identify as conservatives. And his response to us was, what are you going to do? Raise the dead? And he was right to ask that question in some regards. You think about sociology. There are approximately 6,000 sociologists in the United States. We found 12 who were willing to be interviewed and surveyed by us. In many fields, we had to use what's a snowball sample, which was also discussed in the last session. And a snowball sample is something that you use with a difficult to locate population, most often the homeless. So the fact that you have to use this kind of method to actually find conservatives, I think was pretty telling. As well, when we actually did locate them, there was often quite the sense of alarm that they had been outed. What we did is we identified conservatives and libertarians in different fields and said, can you tell us where we can find 10 more people like you? And so they would give us names and then we would contact them. They often were extremely frightened. Some demanded to see our IRB review literature. Some we had to really walk back from the ledge a little bit. They thought that their career was over. One in particular was quite striking. It was a sociologist at a major research university. We were able to eventually convince him to let us interview him. But when we interviewed him, he wouldn't let us meet anywhere near his office. We had to meet in the middle of a botanical garden. As far as I could tell, it was a mile or two away at least from his office. And he was extremely nervous the entire time. You can actually, on the tapes or the recordings, hear him stop talking. And whenever he stopped talking, that meant that he heard footsteps. So it was quite an extraordinary experience just finding some of these people, particularly in some disciplines. But then again, after tenure, people tend to have a much more positive view of their environment. And as Harvey Mansfield likes to say, after you get tenure, you can hoist the Jolly Roger, which many of them did. Although we did find that 1/3 of them, of the faculty we interviewed, hid their politics in some form or other from their colleagues. And if you exclude economics from the sample, it was half of them. It was half of them. And I know there's more recent evidence from Eric Kaufman's survey showing that the self-censorship is even worse than we found. So now I actually want to turn to this question again about just how liberal is the academy, because I think there was something that was not discussed last time, which I think is worth mentioning, which also then affects how the academy functions, and that's the leftward tilt of administrators. It turns out that university administrators are even farther to the left than ordinary faculty members. So there was a 2018 survey by Samuel Abrams. He found that 2/3 of university administrators self-identify as liberal, with 40% of that liberal pool identifying as far left. So overall, the ratio of liberal to conservatives was 12-1. That means that the administrators ratio is over twice the size of the nearest group, right? Legal professions, for instance, is about 6-1, and just in general faculty members, which is also about 6-1. So given the decline of faculty governance and the increased power of administrators on campus, this only serves to magnify, I think, the political imbalance. Consider the recent uproar surrounding Tom Smith, a law school professor at the University of San Diego. He has a blog called The Right Coast. And on March 10th, he commented on a Wall Street Journal article on his blog about the possibility that COVID-19 had originated from a lab in Wuhan. And he said this: if you believe that the coronavirus did not escape from the lab in Wuhan, you have to at least consider that you are an idiot who is swallowing a whole lot of Chinese. And then he had a colorful expression that I previously was unfamiliar with, but you can look it up. Smith's post was obviously directed at China's government, obviously. That did not prevent the school's Asian Pacific American Law Student Association from demanding that he apologize because of the hurt that he caused them. Other students then called on the dean, his dean, Robert Shapiro, to fire him. Despite the student's obvious misunderstanding or deliberate misreading of his post, his dean, Robert Shapiro, sent an email to the law school community alleging that Smith used offensive language in reference to people from China, and announced that Smith would be investigated to see whether university or law school policies have been violated. This investigation is now ongoing. Even if the investigation ends up exonerating Smith, it will still inevitably chill his speech and other faculty speech. So even if your speech is clearly protected under basic principles of academic freedom, or even potentially state law, as Eugene Volokh has argued, might be protected under California law, why comment on a matter of public concern, a controversial matter of public concern, if you're going to be hauled before such thought crime tribunals? The process, as we like to say, is the punishment, and administrators have extraordinary authority to dispense it. So, going back to the explanation for why is the academy so left-leaning. I'm not going to recapitulate all of this, but there are two primary explanations, but then it will lead to a third explanation, which is often commonly given. So the two primary explanations are that the academy is left-leaning because of self-selection and discrimination. And I think Neil Gross, Ethan Foss, and others have mounted a fairly impressive case that the academy has become typed as a left-leaning institution for a very long time, maybe even well over 100 years. And so being a professor then, just in the same way that certain other occupations become typed, like nursing was typed as a female occupation for a long time, people just come to see it as a left-leaning occupation, and then it attracts other left-leaning individuals into it. But then there is, of course, discrimination. And Lee, of course, addressed much of that in the last session, so I'm not going to revisit that. However, there's also the fact that some fields have simply been oriented in such a way as to almost exclude conservatives immediately. So Neil Gross, for instance, in Why Are Professors Liberal and Why Do Conservatives Care, said this: it would be foolish for anyone with truly anti-feminist sensibilities to become a sociologist. Now, Neil might have had in mind someone who prefers, say, gender roles from the Middle Ages, and that's what he means by someone with anti-feminist sensibilities. But one suspects that he has a broader category in mind, that it would include anyone, for instance, who might oppose abortion, or the divorce revolution, or a genderless world. Or you think about literature, the move to critical theory in the 1980s and 90s meant that conservatives who reject the assumptions of Derrida, Foucault, Marx, Freud, and others just found the discipline increasingly, if not totally, inhospitable. So this would also contribute to the minority status of conservatives on college campuses. So while this imbalance is obvious, although there are some who have actually made the claim that the academy isn't as left-leaning as some say. Initially, when I wrote this paper, I said only the innumerate would claim that the academy isn't a left-leaning institution, but just last fall, and we might get into this in the Q&A a little bit, there are some who argued that it's not, mainly because there are some engineers and others who are moderates or something like that. But I think it is obvious that there is an imbalance. It's not necessarily obvious that it matters. Is there any reason to be concerned about the political monoculture in the academy? Many would say this is just the natural order of affairs. Conservatives that, after all, might be fit for other kinds of occupations like business or the military, or maybe the trades. But nothing is really lost if they are underrepresented in the university. Conservatives in this interpretation suffer from a set of unfortunate cognitive defects. They subsist in the dark swamps of rigidity, parochialism, unimaginativeness, and closed-mindedness. Liberals, however, scamper gaily in the sunny uplands of flexibility, cosmopolitanism, creativity, and openness. As law school professor Michael Vidiello declared, the facts that conservatives are more dogmatic, intolerant of ambiguity, rigid and closed-minded than our liberals may explain why fewer of them are hired than their more open-minded, flexible colleagues. Others, such as the philosopher Jerry Server, maintain that conservatism is bound to be an exotic political persuasion among the professoriate because liberalism is the inevitable conclusion of the open-minded. If, he says, you actually take the time to look at history and culture, certain conclusions about human nature, society, and economics tend to force themselves on you. History has a trajectory. Thus, most of those in the liberal arts have concluded that there really isn't any other intellectually respectable way to interpret the broad contours of history and culture. They are liberal, in other words, by deliberate and reasoned choice based upon the best available evidence. Now, unfortunately for this explanation of psychological defectiveness, there's actually not that much evidence for it. Once again, none other than Neil Gross has argued this. He said in Why Are Professors Liberal and Why Do Conservatives Care? The research that currently exists suggests that cognitive and personality factors explain no more than a fraction of the liberalism of American professors. Nevertheless, if you accept this self-congratulatory explanation, it is easy to conclude, along with UCLA historian Russell Jacoby, that the mission of the university is not compromised if it is overrun by liberals. This sanguine interpretation, however, is difficult to reconcile with the two core purposes of the university, teaching and research. And I'm going to argue that even if you are not persuaded on the counts of teaching and research, the cost to teaching and research, ideological homogeneity nevertheless creates political threats that the academy, out of its own self-interest, should find worrisome. So let's move to teaching. Teaching is at the heart of the university. One of the primary conservative critiques of the academy is that that mission is corrupted by left-wing faculty determined to indoctrinate students and turn them into progressive foot soldiers. Thus, knowledge is not transmitted so much as politically curated and force-fed to a captive student population. As Lee pointed out, there's just not a lot of evidence for this concern. I would call it either false or incomplete. One does not need to look far, though, to find stories of attempted political indoctrination in the classroom. Websites like the College Fix and Campus Reform, after all, have entire business models built upon exposing attempted campus indoctrination. Instead, this critique is false or incomplete because there's little evidence that these attempts at indoctrination work. The evidence that we do have indicates that classes designed to promote an ideological end either have no effect or actually increase the attitudes that professors are trying to purge from their charges. Research on diversity trainings in corporate America demonstrate this as well. Significant research on this. Actually tend to reinforce the behavior that they're trying to change. Thus, you could say that these classes might be a waste of time or educational resources. Maybe students should be studying other things, but they don't seem to change political attitudes. Peer groups have a far more robust effect, we think, on student attitudes than a professor, which is difficult, of course, for professors perhaps to admit. But conservatives, when looking for places to change or be concerned about, would probably be better advised to look at offices of student life or residence life, where students are often selected for leadership based on their ideological fitness. Instead, I think that viewpoint homogeneity on campus, as it concerns teaching, should primarily be seen as a lost opportunity. Universities should be the one place in American society where deliberative virtues such as civility, toleration, critical engagement, and mutual respect are modeled. However, it's difficult to do that when there are so few people of different political persuasions around. In the past few years, the university has experienced many embarrassing displays of outrage and even violence by students. Think about Middlebury, for instance, who, they can't fathom the fact that people that they disagree with would be allowed to speak on campus. Perhaps if there were more political diversity among the faculty, students might have learned that it is possible to coexist with those you disagree with. Or if that is asking too much, they might have learned that if there is a guest speaker who holds views so loathsome that you do not even want to hear them, that there's an easy solution: don't go. However, these outbursts point to a second danger of campus echo chambers. Students are not exposed to the necessary range of ideas that they need to be exposed to in order to be prepared to live in a pluralistic society. There can, of course, be interesting and important debates between factions on the left, but the broader American society is not a microcosm of those on the left and the farther left. Somewhere between a third and a half of all Americans would fall somewhere on the right. Thus, while debates between the left and the far left can be valuable on campus, they are not particularly useful for teaching students and the broader community about how to engage with others beyond the university's walls. So whether progressive faculty like it or not, students will one day have to leave the university and confront conservatives, people they disagree with, and grapple with conservative ideas. But today, it's quite possible to receive an education, and an elite one at that, and never be exposed to major intellectual figures from the right, like Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, Milton Friedman, or Friedrich von Hayek. Think, for instance, of Jonathan Haidt, who I know he was on the session yesterday, so he can correct me if my interpretation of his experience is wrong. But think about him, one of our preeminent social psychologists. In The Righteous Mind, he describes how he came across a copy of Jerry Muller's Conservatism, an anthology of conservative thought, in a used bookstore. At the time, he was already a tenured professor at the University of Virginia. Haidt says that he was puzzled by the title because, as a lifelong liberal, I had always assumed that conservatism equals orthodoxy, equals religion, equals faith, which equals rejection of science. So intrigued by a title that implied that there was such a thing as conservative thought, he says, I started reading Muller's introduction while standing in the aisle. But by the third page, I had to sit down on the floor. He says, quite literally floored by discovering there was a kind of conservatism that could compete against liberalism in the court of social science. So while Haidt did not become a conservative, he did start to recognize the importance of conservative ideas and how his education had been limited. Now, one way of thinking about this, an important way of thinking about this, is to ask whether or not this could happen in reverse. What happened to John Haidt could have happened in reverse. To ask, for instance, if a conservative, tenured professor in the social sciences at a major research university could stumble across an anthology of progressive thought or socialist thought in a used bookstore and then be floored by what she reads. Of course not. This could never happen. Outside of a few religious schools, to make your way through the university means swimming in a leftist current. You might try to swim against that current, but if you are conservative, you have no doubt that it exists and where it is trying to take you. Now, if you think of it that way, liberal students Liberal students are done the greatest disservice by political homogeneity on campus, since they are seldom exposed to ideas that they disagree with, while conservative students are constantly forced to defend their ideas and sharpen them. So that's teaching. Now let's turn to research and the cost of research of viewpoint homogeneity. I would argue that political homogeneity also compromises this mission. It does this, as Lee pointed to, by both limiting the questions that we ask and undermining our ability to eliminate error. Political biases inevitably shape what we find important, and when vast swaths of researchers share the same biases, important questions go unasked. And even when researchers in the political minority find them important, they will often refrain from asking them, fearing political reprisals by their colleagues. One political sociologist put it this way: to say a strong conservative political opinion with conviction in an academic gathering is analogous to uttering an obscenity. So heterodox researchers don't want to appear out of step with disciplinary norms. Rather than risk political discrimination, they will try to check the right boxes necessary for professional advancement in their field. There are, of course, many examples of insular academic communities reasoning their way into error. I'll mention a few now. Think of the burgeoning field in history known as the New History of Capitalism. The scholarship in this field was almost exclusively relied on by Matthew Desmond in his contribution to the 1619 Project. It turns out that the New History of Capitalism made some extremely basic accounting errors, leading them to exaggerate the role of slavery in the antebellum American economy. For example, Edward Baptist, in a book, The Half Has Never Been Told, double and even triple counted transactions in cotton production, which caused a vast overestimate, him to vastly overstate the role of slavery in the economy. The economist Bradley Hanson explained the problem here. Anyone who has taken principles of macroeconomics knows that you can't do this. It is referred to as double counting. If I buy $1,000 worth of wood and then make it into a table that I sell for $1,500, we do not add 1,000 and 1,500 because the value of the wood is included in the value of the table, the final good. If he, that is Baptist, is going to engage in double counting for cotton, he would need to engage in double counting for all other goods. Interestingly, in an interview with the World Socialist website, the historian James Oakes, certainly not a man of the right, unless people of the right routinely write for Jacobin magazine, but he's a historian in New York City. He attributes the failings of the New History of Capitalism to the narrowness of history. He thinks it's been overtaken by cultural historians and identitarians. And he explained it this way: so, because of the narrowness of history, the discipline of history now, you don't bump into the economic historian at the mailbox and say, is it true that all wealth came from slavery? And have them say, that's ridiculous, and explain why it can't be true. Oakes even described Desmond's essay as disgraceful. Or think about religious belief, attitudes towards religious belief in the academy. There's a long-standing habit of scholars maintaining that religious belief, and even worse, religious movements, are incompatible with deliberative democracy. Deeply held faith makes believers unable to participate in the give and take required by liberal democracy. Surely there was no better example of this than the pro-life movement bristling with its moralizing zealotry. But when my friend and colleague, John Shields, actually studied pro-life evangelical activists, he found that, quote, the vast majority of Christian right leaders have long labored to inculcate deliberative norms in their rank and file activists, especially the practice of civility and respect, the cultivation of dialogue by listening and asking questions, the rejection of appeals to theology, and the practice of careful moral reasoning. One reviewer, Peter Steinfels, though, joked that his book's title, The Democratic Virtues of the Christian Right, was for academic liberals akin to saying the winning ways of serial killers. These examples, I think, point to the problem of confirmation bias, which is, of course, our tendency to accept findings and theories that are consistent with our pre-existing beliefs. Recently ran across a quote by Thomas Merton capturing this. He said in 1966, "This age is smothered in language and meaningless and inconclusive debate in which, in the last analysis, Nobody listens to anything except what agrees with his own prejudices. Or as Philip Tetlock and Gregory Mitchell succinctly explained, biased information processing is deeply wired into human nature. So for scholarship bearing on political and social topics, this means that weaknesses in arguments supporting favored orthodoxy are less likely to be challenged when political minorities are scarce. When that happens, beliefs ossify into dead academic dogma. Intellectual diversity, therefore, is necessary for rooting out error. One example, I think, where you can see this was the view of the family and the importance of the family among sociologists. Now, the story behind this is can be somewhat complicated, but some of it grows out of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's rather infamous report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which was actually a call for national action, not just for the Black family, but for all of America. There's response to this among particularly academics and academic sociologists, but then you also have the sexual revolution, which then also affected attitudes towards the traditional family. This led James Patterson in he wrote a history of the Moynihan Report. He said that by the late 1970s, widespread rejection by liberal scholars of the report had not only perpetuated the Great Silence, it had hardened into an orthodoxy. And so among academic elites, and particularly in sociology, there was a tendency to say that the family didn't matter, that in fact, that the breakdown of the family was not terribly problematic because kids are resilient, and then it allows them to develop even broader and larger kinship networks. The problem is that the evidence simply does not support that. And eventually sociology came around to recognizing this. One sociologist put it this way. Basically, sociology had to be dragged kicking and screaming until it recognized that broken families aren't good things. It's like if you have to spend decades and millions of dollars in National Science Foundation grants to convince astronomers that the sun rises in the east. So scholars have also connected the problem of confirmation bias to the reproducibility crisis in social science and particularly in psychology. So one of the basic characteristics, of course, of scientific studies is that they're replicable by other scientists. They've run into problems with this. I think one area where you can see this right now, perhaps, although there have been plenty of studies showing that this approach doesn't work terribly effectively, would be with the implicit bias research and the implicit association test. It's the most commonly used of several similar measures. And the IAT purports to explain why racial disparities still exist, even though overt racism has declined and affirmative action programs have been in place. So there are two basic problems with the IAT and similar tests. They're unreliable and they're invalid. For a measure to be reliable, you have to get the same result upon retesting a subject. That does not happen with the IAT. For a measure to be valid, it has to be measuring what it claims to be measuring. That also, it doesn't connect with what it claims to be measuring. So Edward Mockery, a philosopher of science, described it this way. He said the IAT is just the most recent episode in a sad history of irrational exuberance followed by disappointment of attitude measurement by psychologists. And then he offered this summary. He said, we've learned that people aren't really unaware of whatever it is that the IAT measures. So whatever it is that the IAT measures isn't really unconscious. And we've learned that the IAT predicts very little proportion of variance. In particular, only a tiny proportion of biased behavior correlates with IAT scores. We have also learned that your IAT score today will be quite different from your IAT score tomorrow. And it is now clear that there is precious little, perhaps no evidence that whatever it is that the IAT measures causes biased behavior. So we have a measure of an attitude that is not reliable, does not predict behavior well, may not measure anything causally relevant, and does not give us access to the unconscious causes of human behavior. It would be irresponsible to put much stock in it and to build theoretical castles on such quicksand. Despite these fatal problems, the test has been dogmatically accepted as scripture across vast swaths of the academy and has comfortably burrowed its way into general discussion of all the isms that continue to plague us. Given that the IAT is now an article of faith on campus, skeptics are afraid to point out its flaws. For instance, there was a philosophy graduate student who alerted Brian Leiter, an avowedly left-wing philosopher and IAT skeptic at the University of Chicago, He alerted him to another debunking of the test. He asked that Leiter not identify him because folks in my department take this stuff as gospel, so I'd rather not be targeted as a skeptic. Leiter took this as evidence of a totalitarian environment in some departments. Now, my final points. If you don't believe that viewpoint homogeneity creates costs for teaching and research, I still think that the Academy should be concerned about viewpoint homogeneity because of politics and policy. And it should be because of a baser motivation, self-interest. So if principle isn't enough, then self-interest hopefully will persuade you. Universities, it turns out, are soft budgetary targets, and they're made even softer by their political homogeneity. Publicly accountable policymakers are less likely to financially support the university when it is perceived as implacably hostile to roughly a third to half of the electorate. State institutions are particularly vulnerable to political backlash. Just ask the faculty at the University of Wisconsin, or think about the Republican tax plan, which levied a 1.4% tax on university endowments worth at least $500,000 per student. If you don't think that there was some political motivation behind that, I encourage you to talk to some staff members of Republicans who were on Capitol Hill when this tax bill was being passed. Now, politicians don't even have to level divisive charges of liberal bias against the hardest and farthest left-leaning scholars, those who you'll find in the social sciences and humanities. They just have to charge those fields with being impractical or a poor investment. So Rick Scott, when he was governor of Florida, called for cutting funding to the humanities and social sciences and putting into STEM fields. He said, if I'm going to take money from a citizen to put it into education, I want that money to go to degrees where people can get jobs in this state. Is it a vital interest of the state to have more anthropologists? I don't think so. Even President Obama got in on the action a little bit when he made fun of art history majors and their job prospects. So, of course, sometimes, though, the political opposition is obviously political. The opposition is obviously political. Think about Iowa's recent attempt to abolish tenure, right? The fact that it was political does nothing to undermine the fact that they have the authority to do that, at least when it comes to new faculty. So the political isolation of the academy also undermines, I think, the ability of scholarship to influence policy debates. And I think it does this two ways. So if scholars are interested in actually having their research inform policymakers, political homogeneity should be of concern. So first, when asked to weigh in on political and policy debates, it's tempting, very tempting for academics to abuse their authority by speaking with certainty on questions that are, in fact, much in dispute. This will undoubtedly be exposed. And second, when scholars primarily advocate for progressive positions, they risk being seen as ideologues masquerading as scholars. Policymakers will cast a jaundiced eye towards their claims of expertise and authority. So thus, if scholars believe that they are producing research that should inform policy decisions, that would make policy better and improve it, they should be concerned about how being in an overwhelmingly left-leaning institution marginalizes their scholarship. So I think those are the primary reasons to be concerned about the lack of viewpoint diversity in higher education. What is to be done about it? I know this is going to be discussed more. There are some things that perhaps can work, but in the end, I'm not terribly optimistic that much can be done right now. Some have called for affirmative action for political minorities. There's one problem with that. The people who would be the recipients of this benefit oppose it. This is what John Shields and I found, and we asked almost all the conservative professors, would you support affirmative action for conservatives or libertarians? And none of them actually supported it. You have to turn to liberals like John Zimmerman to actually find defenders of the idea. Organizations like Heterodox Academy are wonderful. I think it's done great work. But how much difference has it made? I think it's helped some. Faculty feel more comfortable and being willing to express heterodox opinions, but whether or not it's actually doing anything to improve the pipeline problem, which is ultimately the source of the political imbalance, I don't think that it is. And then finally, there's another effort, and I know some people are who are going to be participating in this conference are involved with it, so I won't say much about it, but it's the Association for Academic Freedom, or Academic Freedom Alliance, which is something like a mutual defense organization like NATO, where if one person is attacked, everyone else has to come to their defense. This I actually do think that will be helpful. I know they've already come to the defense of Tom Smith at the University of San Diego. I think that in the end, you have to impose significant costs on those who would be willing to violate the academic freedom of professors who wander outside the lines of what's considered acceptable opinion. So thank you very much, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to Professor Khalid for a response.
Thank you, Joshua. Your paper's been fascinating and I've really enjoyed reading it. And frankly, I think I agree with pretty much everything you say. You cite the evidence and the skew is clear. So I'm going to use my response as a way to highlight two issues over here. The first one is, and I know, Musa, you're going to talk more about the solutions to the problem, but I might start kind of playing in that sandbox a little bit already. My first point is, you know, when you propose solutions like Heterodox Academy and like Academic Freedom Alliance, and I think they're doing great work, the problem perhaps lies more in light of what you've said with administrators than with faculty. And I would love to see more evidence and data on that beyond Sam Abrams' work. But anecdotally, I mean, I think my experience is the same. And if the problem really is with administrators, because if faculty's indoctrination is having no effect, then where are they getting these ideas, or where are these ideas really taking root? And if I think about the administrators, I want to put this in a broader context, which I think, you know, the kind of administrative bloat and the neoliberalization of the university itself becomes really crucial. And I do think we are at a particular historical juncture where the kind of bloat has defeated the academic purpose of the university, at least to some degree. And I'll flesh this out a little more. Why I'm saying this is because, especially over the last 5 years, but particularly over the last year, what we're beginning to see is that a lot of universities and schools have started having mandatory diversity trainings and anti-racism trainings and cultural sensitivity trainings. They go by various names of that sort, despite the fact that the evidence clearly shows that these are not only ineffective, but they can actually cause more harm. So the interesting thing over here is that the administrators have decided to deal with this particular moment when we could be addressing very vital questions in meaningful ways by choosing to invest, you know, limited resources, especially in COVID time, in these kinds of trainings. And what we're seeing is the industry of diversity and anti-racism trainings kind of blossom and explode at this moment. What does it really say? I mean, I think the divide between administrators and faculty is an interesting one to explore over here, because I feel that universities have kind of reneged their educational purpose in this particular moment by resorting to this kind of training, which has been proven to not work. And that again goes back to the question of the neoliberalization of the university and who calls the shots. So while organizations like Heterodox Academy and AFA may very well be trying to solve the problem by coming at it from a faculty perspective and more political, you know, the need for more political and ideological viewpoint diversity amongst faculty, I think there is reason to think of other ways in which this problem can be addressed. Maybe where, of course, we're all faculty over here and we like to think we're important and we have a big impact, but maybe we're looking in the wrong place, or maybe we need to look at an adjacent place at the same time. So that's the first point I wanted to make. But then the second thing that your paper made me think of is, again, like I said, I concur with everything you said. And the problem really amongst faculty lies in those people, with those people who are so left of center and who are so convinced of the academy being better because of its left focus. Sorry, it's homeschooling time. We're in quarantine. You can lie down over here. So because they're so convinced that it's a good thing for the academy to be liberal, that they're actually not bothered by the fact that there isn't enough viewpoint diversity from conservatives. And I've experienced this on my own campus, very good friends of mine who are faculty, and we've had a few incidents where, you know, conservative students have left Carleton College because they found that they were feeling silenced. And I mentioned this as a point of concern to some of my faculty colleagues, and they were like, yeah, well, good riddance, who wants them here? And those are the people I think we really need to be talking to and addressing and convincing. So I agree, the problem is we need to convince them. But how do we convince them? And I also agree, I like your proposal of more places like Heterodox Academy and AFA. But perhaps one of the reasons that these kinds of places have not, had the kind of impact that you were hoping for is precisely because of the ways in which the mission is framed. I'm a big supporter of these efforts. So let me just say that I'm so glad that Keith Whittington started AFA, and I'm glad to be one of the founding members. Until recently, I was the John Stuart Mill Faculty Fellow at Heterodox Academy. So I'm invested, is what I wanted to say. But the question becomes, if you look at the mission statements, and here I'm going to lightly ruffle some feathers of people in the room, they all talk about the importance of getting to the truth, and that being the mission of higher education. Now, in the process, what I think we're doing is, when we frame the mission as such, here, bear with me 1 second. Sahil, can you please? Yeah, you can have Mama's phone. Go to my room. Yeah.
And you can peel it off. Because I peel that off.
This is the new normal. Sorry. So what I was getting to was, this focus on the truth as the mission of higher education. And of course, I'm not proposing that we start espousing. Bear with me 1 minute. I am so sorry.
Someone's trying to silence her.
And back to being a brain. So the issue of the mission of the truth, and I think framing this in this fashion is alienating a lot of our colleagues. And as a result, the membership of places like Heterodox Academy are self-selection. These are people who, people like us who are interested, but in the process we're alienating and not speaking to, not inviting precisely those faculty that we need to be convincing of the importance of this. And I think many of them are convincible. It's a conversation that we need to have. So perhaps the problem lies in the way that we're framing the tent. And the tent, if we frame it as the search for truth, you're really never going to get those who are postmodernists and post-structuralists and in the studies to come and speak with us. Now, to be clear, I am not a postmodernist or a post-structuralist, so let me be very clear. But most importantly, in this process, what we're doing is that we're really not speaking to the people in the humanities. It's not therefore, and you can see that the membership of Heterodox Academy is dominated by social scientists, and the kinds of frameworks that are being proposed are also very social science frameworks. So my proposal is how about we rethink how we think about the telos of the university? And instead of thinking about it,
What? Yeah, I am in a minute.
No, we were
No.
before.
so my proposal is that we rethink the telos of the university. And if we do that and move away from the search for truth and instead articulate it as critical inquiry, perhaps we'll be able to bring in a lot more people and have precisely the kinds of conversations that we're not having at the moment because they're not coming to us. Because critical inquiry, you can get people in the sciences who'll be on board with that. You can get people in the arts who'll be on board with that. You'll get people in the social sciences, and you'll get the humanities people. Now, why I think it's so critical to invite the people in the humanities is that, well, I'm a historian, so there is a bit of self-interest, but it's not self-interest really, because I think we have something to contribute to the conversation. And that is that our currency is dealing in questions of interpretation, moral complexity, value, common humanity. And these are really the most pressing and controversial issues of our times. So truth for historians, for instance, yes, of course, there's an element of truth that, there are facts, but what makes history more interesting, frankly, is the idea of interpretations. Sorry, Musa, did you have your hand up?
Oh yeah, but for the Q&A later, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to come in now. Okay, and so I am wondering if maybe we need to rethink how we're going to solve this problem. Maybe our framework is not open enough, and maybe we need a bigger tent to invite more people in. I'm just trying to make sure I haven't missed out anything in my notes. Yeah, so for me, the two biggest things, just to kind of wrap up, and I'd love to actually have a discussion over here, because these are precisely the kinds of people I want to talk to about this proposal of rethinking the telos of the university and creating a bigger tent. Is, the one point is, if we have a problem with political homogeneity on campus, then maybe we need to be working with administrators more. And I don't really know how one does that, because I'm at that point where I wonder if there is a fundamental divide between the ways in which bureaucracy works and administrators think and the way in which faculty think. And I see this play out all the time, and I try very hard to bridge it, and I've had some success, but mostly failures. So the imperatives of administration seem to override those of thinking critically about things and engaging with them in a deep way. And if I'm offending administrators in the audience, I apologize. This is not personal, but more structural. And then my second point was about broadening the tent. And also connected to that is maybe we need to rethink viewpoint diversity as well. And that might invite more people in. Our thinking of viewpoint diversity in all these conversations, and in fact, at the heart of Heterodox Academy when it was initially formed, it was very understandably and with good reason, the idea of political diversity. And that only gets us so far. I think if we frame it as diversity of thought within each discipline, which goes beyond political diversity, beyond this kind of simple political diversity of left and right or Democrat and Republican, then we can start getting into, first we'll get more people in, and two, we can really start getting into the meatier discussions of how orthodoxies within disciplines get entrenched and how can we begin to challenge them. So those are my comments, and I'd love to hear from all of you.
Great, thank you very much for that. Now, Musa, you jumped in very promptly, so you take pride of place.
Well, I guess first I'm curious, Josh, do you want to jump in and respond to anything?
Sure, yeah, I have a couple comments on on your comments. So this question of why administrators still keep pushing diversity training when the evidence shows that it doesn't work and actually makes things worse is something I've struggled with for a while, and I don't know that I have a good answer to it. So my suspicions are, one is, I think you alluded to, just the nature of bureaucracy. After all, once you get an administration, you're fully an academic bureaucrat. What comes to mind for me is it's a line from Daniel Borston, former Librarian of Congress, historian. He talked about the bureaucratic fallacy, which was never do something for the first time. And so once something gets kind of locked in as a practice for the bureaucracy, it becomes that loathsome word, best practices, right? Everyone talks about best practice. So this is best practices. So everyone else is doing it. Or it's like IG departments. There used to be a phrase where you never get fired for buying Microsoft, right? So even if they didn't have the best product, that's what you still buy, you're protected. And so the nature of promotion for academic bureaucrats too, I think, contributes to this, is that you go in and you point to your administrative achievements. So for instance, you created a system of implicit bias training for all faculty participating in the hiring process or something like that. And you can, regardless of what the outcomes end up being, you can point to that as an achievement. On the question of kind of reframing, I personally don't have a problem with reframing it as critical inquiry. I think there could be an argument that you lose something, that search for truth should be so much at the heart of the university that by reframing it that way, you lose something. My response to that was, I think we've probably already lost that. And so if you actually want to claw back some of that, reframing it in that way probably gets you moving back in that direction. So I like that idea. And also the rethinking viewpoint diversity. This is where some of the responses to the 1619 project I thought were pretty interesting. And I mentioned one in my talk there. And by the way, most of the 1619 project I thought was very good. There's some elements of it that were historically just false. And those were quite properly called out. But it was interesting that you had people on the right, particularly a lot of libertarians, being very critical of particularly that essay by Matthew Desmond, but then also the World Socialist website, right? Some of the best criticisms came from there, where they were bringing in left of center scholars to identify the problems. So it was kind of strange that there now is this possible common ground between the Marxists and the libertarians on this one particular question, but there was this, they seem to be united about getting the facts right. So I think that is useful. And I think that for some scholars, I mean, hopefully for some scholars on the left, that actually is going to be attractive to them. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, and I apologize for not getting back to you right away, but now we turn to Musa.
Yeah, okay, I'll put my hand down. Yeah, so excellent presentation, both of you. As you guys know, I read a lot on these issues as well. The diversity training, I'll just note, I think part of it too is there's this sort of naive intervention. There's a desire to do something, right? So even if what you're doing doesn't work, if you're a university president or administrator, and something like the social movements in the wake of George Floyd happen, and people are asking you, what are you going to do? Like, doing something, even something that's ineffective, seems like a better option than saying, well, I don't really know what to do, so we're not going to do anything right now. Right? So I think that this sort of impulse towards doing something is part of why things like diversity training also get people keep doing it, even though it's pretty widely understood that it's not very effective at its goal. But I guess the main thing I wanted to talk about briefly was to just second Amna's point, that I think one of the reasons that the viewpoint diversity movement has been less effective than it could be is that in some ways it sets itself up as hostile towards the left, towards the very people that need to be convinced. And that will sort of naturally have limiting, And then similarly kind of sets itself up as hostile towards, I guess you might describe what you might describe as identitarian frameworks for understanding and addressing social issues. And so to the extent that that people sort of start the conversation in a hostile stance or put people in a defensive stance from the get-go, it's going to, that this is a limiting thing. I think one other problem, and then I'll just shut up, and is I think there's kind of a show don't tell issue. So like, for instance, with organizations like Heterodox Academy, they do a lot to make the case for why conservative views are important and people should be engaging with conservative thought. But it's not always clear sort of what are the examples of good conservative thinkers today? What are the examples of how conservative thought could improve, say, a study of studies in a particular field or something like that? There's a lot of like telling, but not a lot of showing, and that makes it very difficult for people to wrap their heads around, sort of to really see the value in concrete terms and to really feel passionate about it. Anyway, I was wondering what you thought about that show don't tell thing, Josh and Amna, and with that, I'm out.
Amna, did you want to jump in? I saw you.
You go first and I'll follow.
Sure. So I think I might need a little bit more clarity on this show don't tell. So it's that the argument that organizations like Heterodox Academy aren't identifying and putting in front of their more liberal colleagues evidence of good conservative scholarship, or that this conservative scholarship isn't there. Or they need to do it. Okay.
Yeah. So for instance, if you went to the Heterodox Academy website, you would see plenty of essays lamenting the lack of conservatives, but you wouldn't see. You would be hard pressed, I think, to find essays that show you what you're missing, right? That show you so what are good conservative, what are some compelling conservative frameworks for engaging in this or that issue, or what are some conservative thinkers that you really overlooked, but if you read their work like John Haidt did, it will floor you. Like, who are those people, right? You'd be hard pressed, I think, to find examples like that on a lot of these websites. So there's a lot of talk about the lack of conservatives, but not a lot of demonstration about how incorporating them would genuinely improve our understanding of the world.
Yeah, so I mean, I could have, so I don't think you're asking me for a list of people right now, correct? Yeah, that's okay. So I do agree with that. Yeah, so here are some people that look, they've written very compelling books that you need to grapple with to get a full understanding of what's happened or how you should view the world. I think that would be, very effective. And yes, because I think you're right. It's been a while since I've gone through the essays on Heterodox Academy, but I think that's correct. Your description is correct. It's all about, here's how it's a really big problem, but not offering, well, here's what you should read in order to help your own understanding of the world. So I'm fully supportive of that.
Yeah, Musa, I absolutely, we've talked many times about this, is yes, this is a problem, which is the show don't tell problem. There's not enough that is being flagged on these platforms that is worth, it's not that it isn't out there, it's just not being presented. And there's, so I feel like Heterodox Academy's done a great job of highlighting the problem and explaining the problem, but then to kind of show a solution forward is where it's stymied. And this is part of the problem, is that it's not showcasing that. And I think that can be solved. I think there is a way forward that Heterodox can do that, but that would require more than getting into the culture wars. It would require actually deep disciplinary engagement, encouraging that in a very robust fashion. And that's what I think that kind of work, because in the abstract, talking about conservative thinkers only gets you so far. So that would be the first response. But you did have another point that you brought up, the diversity training one. I'm going to drop that for now. I have something to say on that, but that can wait. But what I will say is, this. I understand my proposal for critical inquiry is to tell us and to displace truth, not to, not the truth as an important. But what I'm trying to get to is that places like Heterodox Academy do not have an appeal for women's and gender studies. And much as you may have a problem with some of the directions that those studies have gone into, right, or some of the dominant trends, they've made some important contributions. These are places that have these are the areas that argued for listening to minority voices, for thinking about different frameworks. And much as we are today critical in this group of CRT, some of the initial ideas informing critical race theory are actually really valuable. They've opened up ways for engaging in different, it's the issue of going to extremes, but if we don't go to that extreme and appreciate what those frameworks have offered us, I think we could take something from them. And part of this is on us. If we're going to poo-poo it and say, that's it, then we're really, again, it's not a broad tent, and you're not engaged. We're doing ourselves a disservice because we're not engaging with the worthwhile ideas over there. So I think it's a very similar problem to what Professor Kennedy was highlighting yesterday, which is being wedded to a principle. And we're kind of wedded to this principle of truth-seeking without really realizing the harm that's causing. Harm, oh my God, I don't believe I used the language of the day. But in this case, I did mean it, like harm it's causing in terms of the voices we are not engaging with within the academy. And to say, I agree with you, Joshua, I think in many ways, the telos of the university has moved on. It is no longer truth-seeking. And I think I completely agree with Haidt that social justice is not the telos of the university that I want to go to. But what is it? And where can we reclaim that space is something that I'm really interested in investigating. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Professor Baer.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Joshua and Amna, for this interesting conversation. I'm a little bit lost, I think. First of all, I don't totally see the university that you're describing. I'm in the humanities and I was in senior administration for 11 years. There's such vast disagreement within the humanities. I can tell you that people in literature don't agree with one another. So maybe it's not the viewpoint diversity you seek, but the idea that the humanities are outside of this debate and have a monolithic view is not my experience. But I have two specific questions. So let's say there's an assumption, which I don't think is shared around the room, actually. I think that's not correct, that all diversity training is bad and wrong and has been proven wrong. Let's say that's the assumption. But then what I'm hearing is that you're saying, but we should come up with better training ways. And I know that Heterodox Academy, which I can say because it's on the website, offers all sorts of programs and resources and has been funded to provide resources. So aren't Heterodox Academy, as an example, only one example, doing exactly that, saying we're going to have training programs to engage with other viewpoints, with people you disagree with. We're going to teach people to do this. And I can say two things about that. First of all, aren't you just replacing one set of training programs you don't like with one that you like? That's my question, whether the format stays the same. And secondly, as an administrator, I was in administration for 11 years. Just to be pragmatic, faculty hate the word training and cannot and will not be trained. Since I ran many, many programs, I think it's important to be pragmatic. The idea to start with training, workshops, we're going to have difficult conversations. No faculty that I know sign up for these things voluntarily. Maybe that's one of the reasons why these things backfire. You cannot, in my experience, engage faculty with that language from the start. But I'm curious whether I still hear you are sort of looking for a model, and since some of the organizations you mentioned promote and have built such programs, why are those better? And I assume the answer must be because the outcome is what you want versus the format is flawed in itself. That's just my question.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to, one, I'm not saying the humanities are homogenous and monolithic. There's a plenty of debate, and that's exactly what I want to get into. But I'm saying we're not inviting the humanities to this table that we are sitting in with Heterodox Academy, because the frameworks we're using are so truth-centered, which people, people in literature are not going to come to us if we're talking about the truth.
Just I'm in literature, and I actually think I mentioned the truth in the first chapter of my book, and I would say the Chicago principles never mention truth, never mention research, never mention knowledge, and mention freedom 15 times. So I actually think the truth is alive and well in the humanities, Amna. I think it is maybe not the monolithic capital T truth.
Absolutely, I agree, I concur. I think it's great that you're here, but I think on the whole, having been inside Heterodox Academy and seeing it from that perspective, yes, there are a few people who are attracted like you, but on the whole, it's very social science heavy. And I think there is value in, I'm not trying to, again, I'm not saying we throw truth out entirely, and I don't think you do when you put it as critical inquiry. Critical inquiry cannot happen without actually engaging with the truth. So maybe it's like a refining of it to include, half our divisions on campus are not social sciences and hard sciences. What about those people? And why are we not including them in this conversation? So that's my first response. So humanities are not monolithic. We have similar debates, and yes, there are people, and I think those are the people you could actually bring on board if you opened it and framed it in a way that made that possible. 2, diversity training. I am not training faculty, bristle at training, but let me, even before I come to faculty, the evidence against diversity training is mainly coming from corporations. So it's not faculty where it's failing. And it's not the unwillingness of faculty to cooperate. The bulk of the evidence is coming from the corporate sector. So that's just to answer that part. I am not proposing any kind of training. I do not think that training can ever be a substitute for education. I think this is a moment when we should be engaging in deep curricular thinking, in deep educational initiatives, not to try, and this is what I'm saying, the neoliberalization is an issue and we need to contend with, because basically what we've had, and this addresses some of what Musa was saying earlier, is it's the customer is always right, has won out over here, because the students are asking for it and we must do something, therefore we will do this. And that is administrative logic and neoliberal logic. An educational institution should never think about training as the something as their first go-to. An educational institution should think about, how do we engage with this in an educational fashion? That should be ideally their first go-to. But the trouble is it no longer is. And now, to the extent that even we are like, well, they have to do something, and we justify it in that fashion, or we try and make space for it and understand it in that fashion. So I'm not for training of any sort. And I don't, I'm not aware of Heterodox Academy offering training for diversity. I think it's providing a space where you can talk about these things, but I do strongly feel that given how broadly this diversity industry is taking us over, we need to come up with an educational model that may perhaps be called training, but is inherently rooted in a very different framework from the ones that we're seeing right now. So I'm not entirely anti-training per se, and I can get on board somewhat using that terminology to retake that space, because that is educational space. And this idea that universities, are kind of the solution, the quick solution that they're providing with diversity training, again, speaks to the neoliberal logic, because it's like, let's reduce everything that's complex and really difficult to contend with into a simple matrix and teach people what to do, and then we've got it done. Well, it isn't going to be done like that. It's only going to get worse. So I hope that addresses the questions you
asked. Professor Costello.
Hi. So as I was listening to this, I had an interesting article popped up on HuffPost, and it's relevant here. And I thought I would call it to your attention and just to get a reaction. This was a bill that just passed in a Republican legislature in Florida. This came out today. The bill would require schools to survey the personal political views of faculty and students on their campuses and produce an annual report analyzing the extent to which competing ideas and perspectives are presented. Students under this bill would be allowed, if not encouraged, to secretly tape record their professors to get their political views documented and on tape. They said if the surveys describe an academic environment lacking in what the bill describes as viewpoint diversity, the State University System's Board of Governors and the State Board of Education, both of which are controlled by political appointees, could remedy the situation by forcing institutions to adopt codes of conduct. And it just struck me that if universities do not diversify themselves in terms of schools of thought, will we see the political institutions step in to try to do this? And we are in a situation where Republicans control most of the state legislatures. And we've also seen Republicans get very organized under very different subject areas to sort of come together with one type of bill and get it passed through a bunch of different state legislatures. What do we think about this? And is it worth then universities sitting down and looking at, should we really work ourselves to diversify ourselves because we don't want that interference from the political institutions?
Sure. So this is what I was trying to get at with that last discussion of politics and policy. I'm not in favor of this kind of legislation. I oppose blacklists and all this. But if universities don't do something on their own, then you're right. I think that the political institutions will probably try to make them, and it'll end up being much worse for universities. And encouraging students to record professors, I think that's a terrible idea. Although if you're a professor and you aren't assuming that you're being recorded, I think you're very foolish. I think that should be all professors should operate under that assumption now. But yeah, I think this is what universities are going to confront if they don't try to do something meaningful. Now, I will say, actually, I think surveys of the political opinions of faculty and students, those kinds of things are fine just to get something, but then try to create some kind of action plan based on that coming out of a legislature. I mean, the dangers of that are pretty significant, I think, and could be pretty ham-fisted as well. So so I guess that part of it, I guess I don't have much of a problem with. I think we should be interested in, what faculty look like and what their opinions are, but then trying to turn it into some kind of quota system, I think is pretty dangerous.
Jonathan Friedman.
Oh, what an interesting conversation. And thank you, Nancy, for bringing up that worrisome bill, which specifically says that students can record their professors. I mean, any situation where you're empowering the students in the room to record professors surreptitiously, I don't see how that causes anything but a vast chilling effect. But I'm very intrigued, Amna, by what you were talking about in terms of language, because those are some of the reflections that I've had myself in thinking about, Heterodox Academy and the AFA and other efforts that have tried to kind of bring people together around these issues. And I'm really interested. I recently discovered the other heterodoxy social club, which some of you may know existed 100 years ago, was also started in Greenwich Village by radical left-leaning feminists and members of the LGBTQ community who used to gather in social clubs in the Greenwich Village to hear, heterodox ideas and radical ideas and ideas about empowering women and emancipating them that they couldn't discuss anywhere else. And so I'm fascinated by the way in which this word heterodoxy, which could be, an extremely inclusive word, an extremely radical word, or a word that's very open to diverse interpretations, has moved in the past few years to being discussed, to being used as shorthand for conservative. So, for example, Josh, I really enjoyed your book, and I value a lot of things that you've said today, but I do notice that slippage, that way of saying, what happens to heterodox viewpoints, but you don't mean exactly heterodox viewpoints in the way that you're talking about them. You mean this, one set of viewpoints that don't correspond to one set of orthodoxies. I think there are all kinds of orthodoxies in the universities and heterodoxies. Let's bring up another one that comes to mind. My background was in international studies, and I'm always struck by the incredible parochial nationalistic nature of American universities and their discourse. Even our conversations about campus free speech and about academic freedom are remarkably American-centered. There's almost little discussion in any of these conversations about foreign languages. I mean, talk about marginalized in the academy, people who teach courses in foreign languages or about, other world's histories and cultures, often people in area studies centers or who came to the US as immigrants and international students on campuses also experience all kinds of marginalization and a sense of their own heterodoxy, let's say, from the margins. And I think, them and, some in the trans community or in the queer theory worlds would be such natural bedfellows around the concept of heterodoxy if only it were, used in a different way or marshaled in a different way. And maybe, Amna, your points about reframing the conversation about critical inquiry is a more inclusive way to bring them in. One other one which comes to mind too is trying to think about, just the diversity of higher education institutions in the country, and when we have these conversations. And I think that's a point, Musa, that I know you've made before too, that there are many campuses where this isn't that orthodoxy isn't the orthodoxy, and there are all kinds of others in place. And so I just fear, and I really want to push anyone in this sphere to really complicate and nuance our concepts of the university. I mean, any single university is an enormous operation. It has so much internal diversity. I mean, no single person knows what's happening on any single campus in one single day. There's so much going on. There's so many, differences. There's so many different arguments, so many sub arguments and department fights and all of these things. And so to really traverse, university community between the geographers and the international studies department and these scientists who are developing the vaccine, there's just such a complicated array of issues. And I always worry about this effort to boil it down to single orthodoxy or singular heterodoxy. And I think that there's much more room for us to complicate some of these problems. And I think that would actually, I think similar to as Amna was saying, that might actually help us to move toward a more inclusive vision of some of these, what are both the problems and what are the solutions.
So I agree with that it's certainly more complicated than it can sound at times. I think, though, as a practical matter, that conservatives, those on the right, are the most significant political minority on campus, and that's kind of why it slips into that. But you're right that it's complicated. It's even more complicated on the right. I mean, try to figure out what a conservative actually is, right? No one agrees on that. So when we were doing the research, we actually gave up on trying to define conservatism because we had to identify who counts as a conservative. And so for us, we just asked people, do you self-identify? And then try to figure out where they were, and describe their politics and get a sense of it. And they were all over the place. From anarchists, libertarians, socially conservative Catholics. One even described himself as being in favor of Hobbiton politics, which was interesting, right? So, it was very, the diversity was pretty extraordinary, even on the right. It's just, that's the way we do it. In some ways, it just becomes even more simplified to just party identification or voting behavior. So as a political scientist, sometimes I am just tempted to just try to reduce it. Well, how do you vote, right? People tell me how nuanced they are, and I'm like, well, just tell me your voting behavior, and that tells me a lot of what I need to know. So by your voting behavior, you shall know them. And that's just kind of the way it works. But yeah, I think you're right, though, that's simplifying heterodox in the way it has been probably isn't terribly helpful for branding and recruitment purposes.
May I just respond as well? Is that okay, Arthur?
Sure.
So I think, Jonathan, what you've presented is fantastic. Yes, there is a lot of complexity over here within an institution as well. So it's difficult to overgeneralize, and perhaps wrong to as well. Yet certain trends are across the board that are very visible, and perhaps those are not coming. Yes, the kind of liberal dominance within universities is something I think more or less across the board in the US at least. And then the issue of maybe some of those trends are coming from administrative action more than faculty, which make them seem like trends. They all do. It's like, what are our peer institutions doing? I mean, this is one big pet peeve of mine. My own institution is when I go to the leadership and propose something, they're like, well, none of our peer institutions are doing it. And I was like, God forbid we become a leader in any way. So there is a norming that's happening that does helps you track those trends. But I think, and the other point about, I agree with you. I mean, I teach South Asian history. And I am an immigrant over here. And I feel like, in part because of that, I'm able to bring a slightly different lens to this conversation. And everything is so America-centered here. And we would do well to look elsewhere. There is a lot to learn, but there is a particular American arrogance that prevents us from seeing beyond our own borders over here. This is my new adopted home country, so I feel like I can say that. And the other point that comes to mind, which again connects with this idea of having a different lens to look at things from, Joshua, you just said, in political science, at some point you're like, okay, just tell me what you vote like, and let's simplify this and get on with it. Well, I would push back there. Let's not simplify it. Right? Like, why do we not, people who are, as Lee's presentation showed us, they're Republicans on campus who are funding the Democratic Party. So why are we stuck in this very limited binary framework? The most we can get to is moderates. That's the only other category I've seen. So it's either Democrat, Republican, moderates, or then we say just the extremes. But we're not really tracking those things. Maybe we need new frameworks, new terminology, or maybe it's not even new, just more nuanced.
Dustin, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I share Jonathan's dissatisfaction with the way we tend to frame viewpoint diversity as a problem wherein conservative ideas or conservative views are excluded, but for very different reasons than I think Jonathan gave. This is often how we frame the issue. There's a lack of conservative ideas. I think that's been mentioned numerous times. But I think that this is open to two objections. First, that it grossly underestimates the problem of the lack of viewpoint diversity, and it actually is a result of the lack of viewpoint diversity. And to illustrate what I mean, I can just relate briefly an anecdote. In the lead up to this conference, we had various university presidents come to MSU and talk about these issues. And in one of the public discussions we had after one of the public talks, a president of a well-known college said that he would not hire or allow to be hired, if he could help it, at his college, Robbie George, Nietzsche, or St. Thomas Aquinas. Put Robbie George to the side for a moment and just think about Nietzsche and Thomas Aquinas. Are these conservatives that are being excluded? Thomas Aquinas and Nietzsche have virtually nothing in common with one another. But from the point of view of this person, neither belongs in the contemporary university. And this is, this extends also somewhat paradoxically to founders of the liberal Enlightenment project, right? I gather that Smith and Mill and Locke are not read so sympathetically anymore, and I doubt they'd be welcome on college campuses either by this fellow. So what this makes me think is that it's not a matter of simply excluding political conservatives. That's really just how the issue presents itself to us today most immediately, but it's really the most superficial presentation of the issue. And more deeply, it's not just political conservatives who are excluded from campus, but really what it intends to be is alien ideas. I mean, all ideas that are very alien to our time and place are excluded. I mean, if Nietzsche and Aquinas are excluded, it's because they don't fit within our current framework, not because they have hardly anything in common with one another. So I do think that we need to expand our understanding of what a heterodox attitude is.
So I don't know if there's a question, but I agree. Yeah, I don't have any problem. And so that is very, I mean, if you don't want Aquinas or Nietzsche, I mean, that is pretty telling, right? That is, I mean, extraordinary. And I assume Robbie George is out of bounds, not only because he's conservative, but because he's a natural law theorist, right? Is that what makes him unacceptable? So, all right, interesting.
So let me just jump in and say that Dustin's point, it seems to me, is very relevant to Amna's point that we want to think of a better rhetoric for all of this. And as soon as you say you're excluding conservative ideas, then you're off to the culture war that everybody's used to, and everybody gets into their accustomed position and readies for the fight. But to say that alien ideas are excluded, which it seems to me is more correct as a description, then that kind of depoliticizes it, or certainly with respect to the battle that, the battlefield that we live in right now. And I think that's a very good idea to add to the suggestions that Amna had made for finding, different words to use and different concepts to use.
But may I just respond? But words and concepts are the minor part. I think the important part over here is the frameworks, and that the terminology can be there is a fetishization of terminology these days. Everyone wants to create a new pronoun, a new kind of category to identify. I think terminology is critical, but it's not central. Once we have a new framework, I think the terminology will emerge from that. But if we just focus on the terminology, I think we will be stuck in the same framework.
Right, I agree with that. I didn't mean to say, I think maybe I didn't express myself perfectly. I meant, and I think Dustin meant precisely, a larger framework.
Yeah, no, I know what you guys meant. I'm just clarifying for the audience just to make sure exactly that's
okay. Let's see. I think who isn't next on my list here? Well, Professor Whittington, you had your hand up, and now have we lost him?
I'm here. It's just I know we're running short of time, and I got to jump off at 3:30 to do a call.
Oh, sorry. So, so you've got 2 minutes.
I was just going to say, since the Academic Freedom Alliance was brought up in this context, that I certainly sympathize with the potential problem of a sort of messaging concern about talking about the truth to those who are skeptical of it. I've experienced that over time in trying to talk about these issues. I do think that academics universally have a need to value academic freedom and the kind of institutional protections we ought to have for it. And we certainly shouldn't and don't want to discourage people from coming on board that kind of project by talking about what our goals are in a way that turns people off. I know in my own discussions of this in general, I sometimes talk about the importance of truth seeking as part of what it is academics do, while highlighting for some that don't necessarily mean truth seeking with a capital T. But I also try to emphasize critical inquiry and other ways, I think, of saying something that's very similar. But I understand that other people would, I think, probably put more emphasis on the distinctions.
Okay, thank you. Dustin, do we have some contributor from the audience?
We do. So we have a number of questions. Here's one. This breaks our rule. You normally shouldn't remain anonymous, but in this case, this is a clear question. So anonymous attendee asks, I was interested in the idea that training, I think bias training, doesn't work. Then what does work? I agree that compulsory training or compulsory anything is generally frowned upon, but how do you bring people in who are, for a variety of reasons, reluctant to participate and join the conversation?
So my response to that is I have no idea. And if I did know what works, I would probably set up a side gig as being a trainer of some sort. So the general question though about faculty, right? I think, yeah, Uli's point about, faculty just hate training. We all hate, it doesn't matter what the training is. You get cold sweats when you hear that you're gonna have to go through training. So I have no idea what would actually work. I just think the evidence does show, both from the corporate world, and then the fact that also that the training going on now in higher education seems to be based so much on implicit bias. And because the implicit bias test has so many flaws, that's unlikely to be successful or helpful, that it's not going to work either. So I don't know that, I don't know what works. I'm just happy to say that training is disliked universally by faculty. If you frame it that way, it's likely not gonna be successful regardless of what it is. And if someone does have great ideas for how to make these things kind of successful, I'd love to hear them.
I'd like to come in here. I do have great ideas. It's I think training and education. I mean, education, that's what we're in the business of doing. You do it all the time, Joshua. That is how you change hearts and minds. The epistemological roots of training and education are fundamentally different. Training is a box checking exercise. Very good if you're learning particular skills like, how to use Word and how to use Excel and how to work out Zoom. I'm grateful to have my trainers at campus for that. But it's not very good if I want to learn how to have a difficult conversation about difference. Where are the areas that have made that difference possible? In fact, women's and gender studies, arguably, again, it has made it possible. Why is it that we have had this, women are part of the discourse, part of it? Where are those changes coming from? They're coming from these kinds of moves, and they're hard and they take time, and they are, there's no quick fix. I just hate to say it. And I also want to say, I'm very troubled by, particularly in academia over here, how we're so vested in getting quick benefits of diversity without doing all the hard work. Diversity means actually dealing with different ways of engagement. It means getting beyond this notion of collegiality, which is sometimes code for consensus building and keeping your mouth shut, to learning that actually, no, we can have a robust and vociferous debate and discussion. So I would argue that we know the best way forward. It is deep education, and training will never be a substitute for it. And like I said, I can get on board with training, but only that training which is truly rooted in educational principles. I can get on board with the renaming, but there is no shortcut. And again, I find this is something typically American in that we want an instant solution and we want the drive-through, but diversity doesn't come through the drive-through. It comes through hard work.
So I agree with that. And I think you'd still have a problem though, getting faculty on board. I said, oh, we aren't going to do training, but we have to do education. And it's going to take a really long time. And so then so how are you going to recruit them? Yeah.
We don't do it as a re-education camp. Right? We do it the way we've always done it, but just more robustly. We have seminars on campus. We talk about these things, these issues that are pressing in ways we invite people. We have precisely these kinds of conferences where we're talking about them. And I think we can shift the discourse if we do that. I think we can have meaningful conversations. the trouble is, I think we're ceding the place to diversity trainers by not taking this on. And those of us who are taking it on are being pushed out by our administrations because they want a quick fix and this doesn't suit their needs. They'd rather spend $150 on 10 sessions of training and get it done and check the box and then legally protect themselves than actually give me the $150 to conduct a conference and hold these seminars.
I just want to say quickly, grad students are also very hungry a lot of the time for training or for education, for these opportunities that you're describing. They don't come in, they come in expecting that, and then they are move into teaching roles without anyone ever offering it, and they're wondering why. So there's an important space for intervention there.
I'm afraid we need to stop at this point. But there's no danger of any thought being lost because we've wandered off into the subject of the next panel in this discussion. And so we can just pick this up in a half an hour. So thanks very much to all the paper givers, the discussant, and all the questioners. And we'll see you in a half an hour.